What are some creepy facts you know? Before we start with the first story, please hit subscribe and ring the notification bell to stay updated with us. Story 1. Box jellyfish are not only the most venomous jellies to humans, but they also possess at least 24 functional eyes of various degree on its body despite having no centralized brain. 4 of its eyes always peer up out of the water regardless of the animal's body position. Some eyes can make out images, others are more primitive. Story 2. Hearing is the last sense you lose before dying. My dad is a retired EMT or paramedic or firefighter. Years ago, he told me about a guy in cardiac arrest that they brought back to life. The guy ended up coming by the station a few weeks later to thank my dad personally because he had heard, while dead, someone say it was time to call it, but my dad said to keep trying. That story has terrified me, to know you're dead, but not quite dead, and hear other people call it before you're fully gone. Jesus, no thank you. Story 3. I can believe this. I went with my girlfriend to visit her gran in hospice on what turned out to be the day before her gran died. During the visit, my girlfriend went to the loo, and I wasn't sure what to do or say as her gran was essentially comatose. I didn't want to be rude and look at my phone, so I just spoke to her and told her about me as we'd never met. I told her I planned to propose to her granddaughter, and she 100% reacted. Her eyes fluttered, and I think she wanted to try to say something or get a look at this person saying this. She never had the strength, unfortunately, but I didn't expect a reaction and got a fright when she suddenly stirred like that. Story 4. Hundreds of people die every year from being strangled by their bedsheets. I had a heavy blanket that was pretty much coming apart at the seams. The lining was detaching from the blanket itself. I woke up one morning and found my son's head or neck completely entangled in the detached lining. I shook him in a panic and he woke up confused but fine. It looked like someone had actually taken the thing and tried to strangle him with it. I threw that thing straight in the garbage. Story 5. One of the most common places to find a dead body is on the toilet. 'Cause when they're alive and not feeling well, the first thing they do is go to the toilet thinking it could be a bowel issue. It's true. And quite often they'll collapse and fall into that little gap between the toilet and the wall, and you can't get them out to do CPR. I remember our forensic teacher sharing a story where a man's dead body was found in a car with no clothes, no wounds, no bruises. He died because of a brain aneurysm or SMTH. She said that the hot water triggered it. Also, she stated that it is because his veins were thin. Story 6. Herculaneum is better preserved than Pompeii, it just hasn't been excavated as much. Pompeii was essentially destroyed by falling volcanic rock, its dead later being buried by ash after rigor had set in. Herculaneum was destroyed by pyroclastic flows so hot that the liquids in people's bodies turned to vapor and exploded instantly. Brain matter turned into glass. Bone and metal were welded together. All that happened before Pompeii. Currently, the population in the area is so large that the Italian government is having a hard time deciding whether or not it's worth it to warn or evaluate them or not. Story 7. In a strange and semi-creepy coincidence, Robert Lincoln, son of Abraham Lincoln, was saved from falling off a train platform and being run over by Edwin Booth, brother of John Wilkes Booth. Edit. Well, I didn't expect myself to be a history guy to beloan my karma, but here I am, also spelling fixes. Lincoln's son, Robert Todd Lincoln, has the distinction of being present for, or for the direct aftermath of, 3 presidential assassinations, the most of any person. As if that wasn't enough from what I've heard, had a hard time verifying this so grain of salt, Edwin Booth was also a stage actor. Now that isn't the weird part. The weird part is that Irish author and theater worker Bram Stoker, who was described as utterly obsessed with Edwin and probably used it in his 1897 novel Dracula for themes of sexual taboo and sexual frustration. It also means the movie Abe Lincoln Vampire Hunter is extremely accurate to vampire lore. Story 8. Cadaver dogs can smell bodies through waters. Another, not as disturbing, fact. Cadaver dog handlers usually use a different code word instead of saying a name or the word body. An example, Rover, find me a bunny, or Rover, let's go shopping. Instead of Rover, show me where the body is, or Rover, go find the missing person's name. This is due to the nature of what cadaver dogs usually find: bodies, body parts, blood, clothing. It helps ease the mind of worried family or friends of the victim. Saying a phrase such as "go find the body" brings on a negative connotation, whereas "go find a person's name" can bring on negative or false positive connotations. Police and cadaver dog handlers don't want to give the family the idea that their loved one is dead or alive until it's been completely proven. Story 9. During the merger of two black holes, black holes can occasionally get ejected from the system and get shot out into open space and become a wandering black hole. The creepy part for me is that because a large part of the way in which we see black holes is through their interactions with their surroundings, we wouldn't really be able to see it coming towards us. Space is big and stuff moves fast through it. From what I understand, there's a lot of stuff that could wipe us out in a blink of an eye out there. I feel like if a black hole was flying toward us, it would be eating up all sorts of stuff in our galaxy on its way here. Wouldn't we see that? I don't know if the fact that it takes years to see light from even the closest stars would impact that though. Story 10. When salmon begin their famous spawning run, they shut down unnecessary systems so they can channel all of their energy into swimming upstream to mate. That includes the immune system, so spawning salmon are highly susceptible to disease and infection. They basically start to rot before they die. You can see many discolored salmon during their run, and there are even some missing pieces of their bodies. I read about this last year. We are recent transplants to the PNW, so this is all new to me. My daughter and I went to a nearby creek this week to see if the salmon were still doing their thing. Sure enough, we saw one swimming upstream with a big, gaping hole in its back, complete with visible flesh and stringy white things protruding from it. It was awful, but we couldn't look away either. She asked me not to cook salmon for dinner this week. It's one of my favorite meals, but yeah, I'm good for now. Story 11. It's against the law for a pharmacist to tell seniors on Part D they are paying 2.5 times the cost for, let's say, metformin than someone off the street with no insurance. In my hypothetical transaction, the drug costs the pharmacy $2, he charges $4. If grandma comes in W or her Medicare card, she is charged $10 copay. The drug maker then takes $7, leaving $3 instead of $4 as the profit margin to the pharmacy. He is bound by law to say nothing about the scam. Story 12. I was in a creative writing workshop in college and was critiquing a medieval torture section in someone else's piece. My professor was like, "What the crap? Why do you know that?" I told him I wrote a paper on it, but it actually came up in a few historical fiction books. I was curious if it was accurate and fell down a rabbit hole and know just a ton about medieval torture. I did the same a few months ago. It started with one false imprisonment case ages ago in France, but then sites suggest related articles, so I spent 4 hours reading about women being falsely imprisoned. Story 13. Media uses fear to push political agendas on both sides of the political spectrum. This fear is often used to demonize things that are not inherently dangerous simply by creating fear. For example, more people are killed by cows in a few weeks than sharks do in over 20 years, and toilets kill more people in a month than AR-15s do in years. This is not about what is being turned into fear, but rather what it can be used for. Movies, TV, and social media are extremely powerful tools, as the human mind can be easily manipulated from enough exposure. Furthermore, history and even simple logic can be rewritten just by changing a few Google search results and changing the contents of textbooks. Even just removing a scene from a movie can wipe all knowledge of it from existence. Simply by changing a source of information and not saying anything about it to anyone can rewrite everyone's knowledge. TLDR. The human mind is extremely manipulatable. Anything you know could be a lie and you wouldn't know it. Story 14. As a marine biologist, the evolutionary history of eyes is just fascinating to me. The fact that a bunch of different lineages, cubozoans as mentioned, mollusks, vertebrates, etc., have independently developed complex camera eyes that work by the same basic principles but are different in their own unique ways. For example, cephalopods can't see color but can see polarized light. It's just so interesting. Story 15. When I was a kid, I had a really heavy blanket with a detached border. One day I woke up with it tangled around my leg and didn't think much about it. Next day it was on my neck. Thank God my mom was right next to me and helped me out. She cut the detached piece right away. Few years later, as a teenager, I woke up suffocating. I was trapped under my current blanket somehow and struggled real hard to get out. I was purple and couldn't quite breathe for at least half an hour after. It isn't even heavy or big, lol. Why it was so hard to get out of. What's something creepy that has happened to you that you still occasionally think about to this day? Story 1. Pretty sure I almost got kidnapped when I was a kid. I was 10 years old walking home from school and an elderly couple driving by stopped and asked me for directions. They were looking for the street I was walking towards, so I pointed them in that direction. Even though my directions were very clear, both were acting confused and asked if I could get in the car and guide them there and then they would drive me home. I told them it was fine, my house was right here. I lied. They were pressuring or guilting me a lot and being too nice about wanting to drive me home. It gave me a really weird feeling in my stomach. So I pretended to walk towards a house that wasn't mine and they drove off. Story 2. When I was 10 years old, I lived in the middle of rural Alabama. We had some odd neighbors. Being curious kids, my friend and I followed my neighbor and his son and daughter one day when they left their house and walked into the woods. I was very familiar with the area because it was back when kids could roam free until the street lights came on. Anyway, we trailed them for about 2 miles, through the woods, across an old cemetery, and down a railroad. They stopped at a clearing beside the tracks and my friend and I hid opposite of them and watched. They started digging and kept pulling up bones and putting them in a bucket. We got scared and bolted. I immediately told my parents, but they didn't believe me. I'm 32 and remember that day clearly. Story 3. I was probably 11 or 12. There was a telephone pole in our backyard that stood in the middle of our back fence. An electrician was working on it and needed access to our backyard for a couple days. One of the nights, my best friend was over for a sleepover, and we were in the fort we made in my room. I was facing toward her, away from my bedroom door, and she gets startled and lets put kind of a half-hearted scream or yelp. She said she thought for a split second she saw a man's face peering between the sheets through the entrance to our fort. We both felt really creeped out the rest of the night, but just fell asleep eventually. The next day or so my family realized that 2 of our motor scooters we kept in the back were missing, and sometime later my dad recognized the electrician on Sacramento's Top 10 Wanted. I'm pretty sure that night was the night he stole the scooters, and he must have come inside the house through the back door and left or something when he realized we were awake. Story 4. When I was in 3rd grade, I was home alone with my quadriplegic grandma from after school until my mom came home. One day the phone rings, and I answer it and an unfamiliar man's voice says, "Hey, just on a morbite, did you just get home from school?" I say, "Yeah, who is this?" Instead of answering me, he started asking things like, "Do you ever touch yourself? Do you like to look at girls?" Being in 3rd grade, of course, I was like, "Nope," and hung up pretty quick. I told my parents, but nothing ever came of it. I still wonder to this day who it was, how they knew my name, and my whereabouts. This was back on a corded landline with no caller ID either. Story 5. I can't really remember how old I was, maybe 8 or 9 years old. But I was walking to school and this older guy was going the other direction. I remember thinking he looked weird, because it was early so the daylight was fairly dim, but he wore sunglasses, it wasn't cold, but he was wearing a black trench coat. I stepped off the sidewalk to go around him out of arm's distance because even my child brain registered that he wasn't someone I wanted to allow close to me. Turns out I was right. This wacko starts kicking leaves and throwing mulch at me from a nearby garden. I was too freaked out to register what he was shouting, but he was grunting out something. I sprinted for about 2 blocks before I got to the crossing guard in front of my school. I thought about not telling someone, but it kept haunting me for the rest of the day until I finally told my parents. We filed a police report, but I have no idea what happened to him. Story 6. I was about 12 years old and I was playing hide and seek. I was hiding behind a tree, but it was also next to a road. Two guys pulled up in a car and asked if I wanted to see their dog. I said sure. Then they said it was in the back seat and I would have to go into the car to see it. At that point I was getting a bad feeling, so I said never mind. They insisted one more time for me to see it in the back seat and I said no. Sometimes I wonder where I would be now if I was stupid enough to do it, and how terrifyingly easy it is to lure other kids into that situation. Story 7. I grew up in a decently rural area about 40 minutes outside a city. One of my neighbors had to call the cops once because someone was back on their property late at night and had started a fire. Cops show up and arrest a man who had eliminated his girlfriend and was trying to burn the body. Dumbass pulled off the road thinking he was in the middle of nowhere and was actually only like 50 foot from the back porch of one house and in view of multiple. But yeah, when I would jog by that stretch of road, I'd run a little faster. Story 8. I had a stalker in college. Had to move dorm rooms and building 4 times in the middle of the night. Friends would help me get to my dorm by pretending we were going to theirs and making sure no one was around when I'd go into mine. He found 2 of the dorms and left notes in my room. It's been over 11 years and I live in a completely different state, but every once in a while I get the feeling I'm being watched and panic. Story 9. My dad never went on vacations with us, workaholic. So every year it was my mom, my 2 sisters and I. One year we rented a little cabin at Lake of the Ozarks. A storm rolled in one night, and in the flashes of lightning you could just make out an old lady standing out in the storm watching our little cabin. My mom got more and more freaked out as time passed, and the lady just stood there, hair blowing in the wind, staring at us. Mom finally got the nerve to call out to her, "Go away. You don't belong here." But she wouldn't budge. Next morning, the sun comes up and she's still standing there. Only it turns out it's a mop draped over a clothesline. Story 10. When I was maybe 10, I was over at a friend's house hanging out. Her neighbor was out of town and my friend was feeding the cat while they were gone. So my friend and I went over to feed the cat. Immediately upon opening the door, we heard someone walking upstairs. They were loud, heavy, slow footsteps like they didn't even sound human. My friend and I just looked at each other and sprinted back to her house. The worst part was we told her mom and the mom didn't believe us and made us go back and finish feeding the cat alone. We were terrified but did it. When the neighbor came back, they found that their house had been broken into. Story 11. When I was around 11, I was at softball practice, and for whatever reason the practice ended early, so I had to wait at the park for my grandpa to come and pick me up. I ended up having to wait alone for about 30 minutes because I didn't have a cell phone to call and tell my grandpa that practice ended early. I remember sitting on the swings when an adult man, in his 30s or 40s, came and sat down next to me. He asked if he knew me and I said no, and he told me that I must just have one of those pretty faces that feel recognizable to anybody. I remember feeling happy about the compliment and I kept talking to him. Eventually, he told me that he had his car with him and that he could drive me home to my grandparents' house so that they didn't have to worry about picking me up and I wouldn't have to wait any longer. Being 11, I didn't think anything of this and proceeded to get into this stranger's car. Luckily, my grandpa showed up just in time and I remember seeing his car and jumping out to meet him. The stranger sped off without talking to my grandpa, and that was the last I ever heard about it. This is such a vivid memory for me, and I often find myself thinking about what would have happened to me and what a different person I would be today if my grandpa hadn't shown up when he did. Story 12. My mom used to start at work at like 3 a.m. and she was up at about 2 to 2:30 having her coffee. I heard her up and went to see her. She joked that she heard something outside, and me being a bit silly opened the blinds up wide as a joke, and there was a guy just standing there staring into the lounge room. That was creepy enough as it is, but what sticks with me is the fact he didn't run or really react for what felt like an eternity. While I ran to get my old man and brother, apparently he just stood there and then slowly walked off. Story 13. I was followed home once. I was 23 at the time. I'm female and I lived a 5-minute walk to a busy bar area. I noticed him following me and I went to a full-out run to get into my building. The guy also ran, but luckily by the time he got to the entrance to my building, the glass sliding door had shut, automatic buzz door. The absolutely terrifying part was that as I stood there behind the glass catching my breath, he just stood there staring at me. Didn't walk away or anything. What in the heck was he planning to do if he caught me? Still gives me the shakes 5 years later. Story 14. When I was in middle school, my girlfriends and I rode the bus home most days. The bus driver was this older guy who was super nice and fun and would allow us to play whatever radio station we wanted, and he would drop us girls off at home last so we could dance around on the bus. I remember he would let us stand at the front of the bus while he drove, and he would purposely swerve to make us fall on top of him. I remember thinking it was weird, but it wasn't until I got older that I realized how wrong that all was. I decided to Google his name. I'm now in my 30s and found that he is a convicted sex offender and is currently incarcerated. Scary part is when I think back, he obviously knew where I lived, and I remember there were several times when he'd drive past my house on the days I wouldn't ride with him. Keep in mind, driving past my house was out of the way of his normal route, so it was intentional. Story 15. Someone broke into my house while I was home alone when I was 19. I found them hiding behind this 7-foot-tall toolbox my dad had in the basement. I was about 5 feet away and saw their hands. I told them I was going to let them leave out the back door, but I was calling the cops. I locked the basement door and ran upstairs, watched them run down the street with their shirts pulled up over their heads. About a month later, we got back from a trip out of town and we had been robbed. I can't imagine it wasn't the same person. What's a creepy fact you wish you never learned? Story 1. My father's school did a guided tour through the woods searching and learning about local herbs. A few years later, my father was still a child. Police showed up and asked him if he recognized the man in a picture that they showed him. My father explained that he was the herbalist tour guide. Apparently, the guy had eliminated several boys and had my father's name and address in his car. The police had caught the guy by this point. I think he died in suspicious circumstances. Story 2. Well, all of these make my flatworm tidbit seem meek. When flatworms mate, two males use their bifurcated penises to fence one another. The winner, or the flatworm who stabs the other with its penis dagger, remains a male while the loser becomes female and will be impregnated. Edit to correct the meaning of bifurcated. They don't detach it. Bifurcated means split in two. Story 3. Some people are born with a malformed mass of veins in their brain called an AVM, and they have no idea unless it's seen on a CT or MRI. Then one day it can burst without warning, and that happy, healthy person can die, suffer brain damage, paralysis, etc. No warning. This happened to my 22-year-old niece yesterday. She is in a coma now. It's heartbreaking. This happened to a buddy of mine. He was driving down the road and pulled over to call EMS after he realized he had no idea who he was or where he was going. Luckily, they got him to a major hospital which was able to perform neurosurgery and fix it. Story 4. Nurse here. I learned that some people will use any hole in a sexual way, including a surgical hole in the stomach to collect poop into a bag, a colostomy. Additionally, some folks with these kinds of holes will prostitute themselves out for use of that hole. How do we know? They come in with infections in these holes and own up to the behavior. I also learned this sexual act is called a Philly sidecar. Story 5. I had to have a C-section when our daughter was born and heard one doctor say to the other doctor, "Pass me the uterus, I'm gonna clean it." Still don't know whether my uterus was actually lifted out. Still don't want to know. Update, I am, thankfully, not as squeamish as my post may have made me look. When I heard that sentence, I immediately thought, wow, if I were more squeamish, I would probably be horrified right now / crying. I know that people working in the medical field consider this normal, and that's okay. Stuff like this becomes normal when you have to deal with it every day. Just felt they could have said that less loudly or signaled to their colleague, as not everyone wants to know that. Story 6. Ascaris worms are a type of large, parasitic roundworm that make their home in the human digestive tract. They are endemic in many parts of the world. I used to work at a hospital where we took a lot of patients from very poor and remote places, especially Central America, where roundworm infection is very common. When you put those patients under for surgery, the anesthesia causes their blood to become slightly alkaline, which the worms hate. So after a few minutes, they will start coming out of every orifice in the body. Nose, mouth, rectum. And I'm talking full-sized worms that look just like earthworms. It is no cap, one of the grossest things you can imagine. You give those patients a drug called bendazole, they poop dead worms for 3 days, and then they're fine. Story 7. Carl Tanzler fell in love with Maria Elena Milagro de Hoyos, a young tuberculosis patient at the Key West Hospital where he was a radiology technician, but his fondness grew into an obsession after she died in 1931. Tanzler lived with the corpse of the woman he loved for 7 years. When she started to decompose, he embalmed her body and stuffed her with cotton wool. When she was eventually discovered, he was asked at his trial if he ever consummated their relationship. He said no, but stuff was found in the cotton wool of her, bathing suit area. Story 8. When you are in the process of dying, the last part of your brain function to go is related to your hearing. Essentially, you can hear everything around you, but you're locked in. Whether you can comprehend it is for a person much smarter than me to answer. But imagine understanding that the people around you are mourning and all you can do is listen. Or even worse, there's nobody. Story 9. Vacuum decay. Theoretically, if some quantum tunneling event occurs in deep space, it can sort of unmake the physical laws of the universe and it will just stop. This effect will spread out at superluminal speeds. This can occur in the same way a shadow can move faster than light, or the expansion of the universe itself can move faster than light. These dead areas are also invisible as they, by their very nature, emit no radiation, absorb any that ventures in, and move so fast the only way you know one was coming was that all the stars near you would all blink out in a matter of weeks. Story 10. Most people do not know one of the reasons why AC electricity can eliminate you. In order to generate electricity, the power companies spin a magnet inside a coil of wire, or spin a coil around a magnet. The angular frequency that the coil or magnet is spun at is about 50 Hz to 60 Hz. More than 30 milliamperes of AC, RMS, 60 Hz, or 300-500 mA of DC at high voltage can cause fibrillation, irregular heartbeat. Basically, AC current goes back and forth really fast and can pump your heart for your brain instead. Your brain thinks something else is pumping the heart for it, so it stops. Once you let go of the object you're being electrocuted by, the brain doesn't clue in to pump the heart again because it thought something else was doing it. Scary, very scary. Story 11. My dog recently passed away, so I had to pick him up and hold him on the way to the vet. I had to keep reminding myself that the breathing I heard was just me pushing the air out of his lungs. Edit. I didn't expect this to blow up as much as it did. First, I want to thank everyone for the condolences, and I share my condolences with everyone else who has recently lost their furry companions. I also want to take this soapbox for a little bit to talk about death because we, as a society, don't discuss it enough. Because we don't talk or think about it, not a lot of people are prepared when it happens. The truth is that everyone you ever knew, every pet you ever had, will someday die. Accepting this fact makes it easier to deal with. There is nothing I can do for Luigi now that he has passed away, other than to live my life as I need to, and remember him fondly forever. Obviously, everyone grieves differently, but I hope to share my perspective with hopes that it helps one person to find a way to accept the death of a loved one. Story 12. I've heard a scientific theory as to why we get the uncanny valley goosebumps. Back in the day when Homo sapiens competed with the Neanderthals, there was a theory that Homo sapiens was being cannibalized by other offshoots of Homo erectus. Thus, the uncanny valley feeling evolved from us feeling that something would be off about that person coming towards you. Friend-shaped, but not friend. Sick and dead people are way more likely, considering that all evidence we have points towards the different species of humans treating each other like fellow humans. Story 13. If you find yourself in the Amazon and go for a swim in a river and own a penis you'd like to keep, do not pee. Kangaroo fish are attracted to a chemical in urine and will follow the scent to where it's strongest, and the babies will go right up your pee hole. Then it will grow and rot inside there and cause an infection. Then again, apparently this hasn't been proven by science, but I'll trust the locals on it. They've been living there longer. Story 14. The Byford Dolphin Incident, specifically what happened to the one diver as the pod instantly decompressed, causing his body to get sucked through a few-inch crescent gap by literal tons of pressure. His remains ejected from the pod onto the deck, an empty skin sack with mangled bones, some limbs severed completely from his body. His organs were described as perfectly intact and removed from his torso. His head turned to mush. Some parts were never recovered, thought to have launched into the sea. A horrific, Mortal Kombat-like fatality, near instantaneous. I'm relieved knowing it was extremely quick, but it haunts me to imagine the last moment of this man's life or the scene post-mortem. The autopsy report and images of the disaster along with his images have been released to the public. Tread lightly. Story 15. I worked for a private investigator doing editing. The devices they had were insane. Literally anything can be a camera these days. Chargers, car keys, water bottles, chapsticks. The videos they would get made me realize just how unaware people are to being recorded. We were short-handed for a few weeks and I drove with one of the investigators to do a stakeout. We followed people around all day and they had no idea. It's scary to know that if you are being tracked you will almost never know. What are some very creepy facts? Story 1. There is a genetic disease called fibrodysplasia ossificans progressiva. When tissue is damaged, it is replaced with bone. Growths form underneath their skin and their joints lock solid, so over time those affected slowly become encased in a prison of bone just beneath their own skin. They usually have to choose between sitting or standing up for the rest of their life. By the end of their life, they have to drink every meal through a straw and can barely move. Story 2. Bacteria and viruses can be frozen for millions of years and still be viably infectious, and having never encountered humanity before, could have no end of catastrophic results should they be uncovered and manage to infect a person or animal. Not to worry though, it's not like millions of ancient pathogens are currently trapped in permafrost, which is now melting bit by bit each and every day. Story 3. Rosemary Kennedy was JFK's sister. She suffered from oxygen deprivation at birth, and that unfortunately stunted her mental growth. She had a pretty decent childhood, but as she grew older she began to act out. Afraid that her behavior would risk his political career, her father, Joseph, agreed to have her lobotomized. Her mother, Rose, was against it and forbade him from doing it. So he did it behind her back when she went on a trip. After the operation, Rosemary's already low IQ was lowered even further, to the point she could no longer walk or communicate. Her family had her locked up in an institution and basically disowned her. They never visited and never publicly acknowledged her anymore. Rosemary died at the age of 86. Her mother never forgave her husband for what he had done. Story 4. Imagine being totally aware of someone performing CPR, but you physically can't move or respond. Well, that's what happens when you get bitten by a blue-ringed octopus. You have approximate 6 minutes between being bitten and someone starting CPR to keep your heart and lungs functioning to ensure you survive, all whilst being totally aware of what is happening to you. Neurotoxins are fun. Story 5. Blobfish in its natural habitat looks like a normal fish, but it lives so deep underwater that it doesn't use a normal gas bladder to keep itself balanced. Instead, it has a spongy skin that is slightly less dense than water, which becomes damaged and bloated when fishermen bring it up too quickly. It's not really the ugliest fish. It has just experienced something worse than one of us being thrown into outer space. Between sea level and space, there's one atmospheric pressure of difference. Between sea level and 2,000 feet underwater, their upper limit, there's 60 atmospheres of difference. Story 6. Locusts aren't a type of animal, they're a condition some grasshoppers experience. Many species of grasshoppers become locusts when they're too crowded, literally their legs rubbing together triggers the change. Once grasshoppers start to swarm, they will join up with others, physically grow larger, change color, and eat basically anything they find. Most of a swarm will be born as part of the swarm. Increased mating is part of swarm behavior. This is why it often seems like locust swarms come out of nowhere. A very small percent of grasshopper species swarm, and not all those that do undergo physical changes. Your garden variety grasshopper is probably harmless. Especially if you're in NA where there's only one species that swarms and it's super rare. Grasshoppers who do swarm are often called locusts even when not swarming. It's less of a grasshoppers catch locust situation and more of a there are subset of grasshoppers called locusts who swarm. Story 7. A black mamba is the fastest snake, which can slither at a speed of 12.5 miles an hour, 20 kilometers per hour. They have neurotoxins which are fast-acting. The venom shuts down the nervous system and paralyzes the victim. Its venom is able to kill 10 people and it repeatedly bites. To add on to this, there is an almost 100% kill rate and can kill in 20 minutes. Story 8. Cockroaches have been recorded eating human flesh, both living and dead, as well as fingernails, eyelashes, feet, and hands. The American cockroach and German cockroach are more likely to bite humans than other species. Pretty sure Australian cockroaches do something equally creepy, but as an Australian who plans to sleep at some point in the future, I'm not going to Google it. There are many studies that show they don't like human contact and will clean themselves rigorously if they touch us. Our skin is very oily and can suffocate the breathing holes in their carapace. Story 9. The stonefish, an incredibly venomous fish living in tropical waters, mostly off the coast of Australia and parts of US, can cause pain that only escalates with time. Eventually, the pain will subside, but even after the barb is removed, patients have reported increasing pain 12+ hours later. Without antivenom or denaturing the venom with excessive heat, the pain builds and builds until the patients request euthanasia. Its spines hold the venom, hidden in its dorsal fins. Aboriginals living around the Great Barrier Reef have corroborees, large gatherings, and will during these gatherings hold reenactments of people being stung by this monster for what I assume is either amusement, learning, or both. Story 10. The origins of vampires as we know them. Basically, your body has gas build up when you die. I'm not medically inclined enough to explain why. Basically, the gas has to escape somehow, and so it would pass through the vocal cords in the throat. This creates the low moan that makes the body sound as if it was in pain. The people back then had no idea what was happening, and random bodies would just start moaning in pain. And thus they believed that the bodies were rising from the dead, and when stabbed, the gas escaped otherwise. Thus leading to the belief that the only way to stop a vampire was to stab a dead body in the chest. This also led to a lot of strange burials. I doubt either man that was buried in a stone wall to prevent him from rising from the dead. Story 11. In 2015, a young woman began to have headaches. They discovered that she had a brain tumor, and when the doctors removed it, they were shocked to see that it was a lump resembling skin that contained bone, teeth, and hair. But this was no parasitic twin. The mass was called a teratoma, or monstrous tumor. When the woman was an embryo, some cell tissue fell off and ended up where it wasn't supposed to be, her brain. It then developed hair and teeth while the rest of her grew as normal. Story 12. It's less of a fact and more of an uncomfortable truth, but it would be very easy for a determined individual to break into your place of residence and kill you at just about any time that you aren't expecting them. Even worse is that if they do it cleanly and have no relationship with you, they stand a decent chance of getting away with it. Edit. For clarity, I said determined individual because most normal locks, dogs, weapons, walls, fences, cameras, lights, etc. will be enough to deter thieves or just some whack job. The point of my comment is to say that if someone genuinely wants to get you, either they will or they'll die trying, and odds are, if you aren't expecting it, the first thing is what will happen. Story 13. I find that the most disturbing facts are space-related, and also it's crazy to me how little we truly know of the mysterious universe. We like to think we are smart because we are the most intelligent thing we know of, but when you look at the galaxies roaming the universe on a near infinite scale, the possibilities are legitimately endless. I heard that the size of the observable universe compared to the expansion of the Big Bang 8 billion years ago, that the size of the actual universe could be as much as 900 times bigger, and light just hasn't traveled far enough to reach us. Could you imagine the size of that? It's inconceivable. I hope that when we die, we get to go to a dimension where we just know everything about everything and all mysterious things are revealed. And when we have enough time exploring everything again, we can choose to be born as life again on some other planet and face our own challenges from a different perspective. Story 14. Psychoanalysis has concluded, basically, that we are made up of subpersonalities, all with their own wills, motivations, and impulses. The further you go down the subject of self and what you are, you find you're not really you, and what you consider you is a fragmented part of the whole, maybe the ego or something analogous to it. It's freaky because we can feel foreign even to ourselves, and in a way we are foreign to ourselves. It's just a complete mystery, and finding answers inevitably raises more questions. Story 15. Some of the declassified false flag operations the USA was going to launch on itself to incite war. There was also time in the Cold War where a base in Alaska was watching Russia to see if it was launching nukes. Their radar detected thousands of warheads coming over the horizon on the first night. The base couldn't get a hold of command and contemplated a counterattack. They called Canada as a last-second resort, and we said to wait a couple minutes first, and it ended up just being the moon. If it wasn't for that Canadian general answering that call, the Cold War could have kicked off right then and there. Rural folk, what is the most creepy thing you've seen or experienced? Story 1. I live in rural Wisconsin. Surrounded by corn, marsh, the works. I remember I was in my teens, outside at dusk with my parents, but we were all doing our own thing. Suddenly a woman's voice yells, "Help me," from the woods beside our house. Just loud enough to hear, but quiet enough for me to second guess what I heard. My mom and dad both turned to look at me like, "You heard that too, right?" Mom starts screaming, "Do you need help? Where are you?" It's moved from dusk to pitch black now, and the hair stood up on my neck because it got too quiet. Mom wanted to keep yelling, but Dad just got up from his chair and said, "Inside." I think that's one of the only times I've seen or listened to him. Story 2. Australia has a reputation for scary animals, but people don't ever talk about the sounds you hear. The cutest, most fluffy, sweet-faced little animals make demon noises in the dark. Our birds scream, possums sound horror movie noises, koalas sound like giant monsters. All of these are completely harmless. Generally, the dangerous animals are, coincidentally, the ones you can't hear. I've done a job for a few years now noise monitoring, generally of coal mines in rural areas. Obviously, my first night on the job when I was 18 years old, I was out by myself quietly listening to the mine from a dirt road near a farm property. Next minute, I hear what sounds like a woman scream over and over and over. Didn't really know what to do, but noted it down as screaming. When my boss read my notes, he said, "Oh yeah, there's an owl that sounds like that." An owl indistinguishable from a human scream. Story 3. Used to live in rural Philippines in a tiny fishing village in Tinambacan. Right next to our house was a fenced-off lot that had been overgrown and a really broken-down house. It always looked really creepy at night, and kids in the neighborhood told me it was haunted. From our rooftop you could look into the lot. One night I was looking at it, and I saw a strange blue glow coming from inside and shadows moving across the windows. I couldn't place it at all and didn't hear any noise, no people speaking or any indication of what was causing it. Really scared me. I brought it up to my family and they told me drag queens were squatting there overnight so that they could attend a nearby disco. So, that was relieving. Story 4. A friend of mine lived in a semi-rural area growing up. One night the cops knocked on her door and warned her that they were looking for a possibly violent fugitive. Told her they'd check her property and that she should lock up and be wary. It wasn't until some time later that she found out the full story. The fugitive had been caught sexually assaulting a horse in a local stable. In the ensuing panic, the horse's leg was broken and the man got away. He was found 2 days later hiding in a stormwater drain. Story 5. Grew up in a very rural area of Kentucky on a property that was about 75 combined acres of woods and empty fields out a dead-end, one-lane road. One night when I was a kid, I was sent to take the trash out to the dumpster after dark. The dumpster was already at the bottom of the driveway. About the time I reached the dumpster, I heard the most blood-curdling scream I have ever heard. Like a woman was being brutally murdered right in my ear. I flew back to the house and had a full-on come apart, crying and telling my dad to get a gun. Fox screams will make your blood run cold. Story 6. Live out in the country, I realized one night that we never got the mail that day, so I walked out to the road to get it. No moon that night, so it was pitch black, just the sound of crickets and tree frogs. As I'm walking back up the driveway, I hear my husband whistling. From the direction it's coming from, it seems he walked out the back door and was coming around the side of the house towards me. I didn't know why and didn't bother to ask. I just went up on the porch and back in the front door. Just then my husband came out of the bathroom. I still get freaked out a little when I think about it. It was 100% a human whistling a tune, and both humans were in the house. Story 7. My family lives in an old farmhouse surrounded by a lake, field, and forest. No neighbors nearby. No reason for outsiders being near. It's a dead-end road. This happened to my aunt when she was dog sitting. She wakes up in the middle of the night to some noise. Our dog was a less than helpful guard dog, and she didn't alert her at all. Aunt sees several people outside with flashlights walking around the yard. She panics and immediately puts on all the lights, and the people escape. She called the cops, but it would have taken them an hour to get there. Nothing was taken, but sure scared the out of my aunt. Story 8. I used to live 30 minutes away from where I am now in the Philippines, and back then there weren't any convenience stores or supermarkets nearby in my village. It was just all grass, trees, and vines, perfect if you want to hide mutilated or sacked bodies. One day, my parents and I drove home from my preschool. Suddenly my dad went silent and told me not to look. I was stupid enough to disobey, and saw someone hanging from the trees with their neck. We learned later on that people were eliminating themselves because of destitution and personal conflict. Story 9. I live in a fairly rural part of NJ surrounded by forest and hills. One night in high school, my friends and I were driving down one of the local back roads to find a place to chill and smoke. As we're driving, a deer jumps out in front of the car, as they normally do. This time though, as we slowed down, the deer turned around back the way it came, walked up to a tree, and then proceeded to bash its head in on the tree in one hit and fall dead. It didn't run into the tree, it walked over and then slammed its head into it. It was the weirdest behavior we've ever seen. Could have been rabies, but was really freaky. Unsettled all of us, and we decided to go back and smoke at my friend's house. Also, fox screams. Story 10. Grew up spending a ton of time in the Colorado Rockies. In college, a friend and I were on a weekend backpacking trip up in National Forest land, about 300 yards off trail, when we stumbled across a mostly buried bunker someone had made. Think a 20-foot-long tough shed, buried up to its roof. We only noticed it because the sun glinted off one of two small windows in the roof, which had been deliberately covered with brush/tree litter. Looking through the windows, we could make out a cot, buckets and tubs of food and supplies, etc. Found the door, concealed/partially buried, which had a heavy padlock securing it. Noped out of there with a quickness, didn't want to run into whoever had built the place. Story 11. I used to live in the desert for a year, and on nights when the moon isn't out or there are clouds blocking out the stars, and moon it's almost pitch black, you can't see more than 10 yards ahead of you. One night I was driving down the highway going home, and then suddenly in my headlights I see a guy running on the side of the highway full on sprinting. I'm going 70 miles per hour, so it's only for a second or two, but I'm like, what was he running from? I hope he's okay because I'm not pulling over LMAO, but then maybe a minute later I see another guy in my headlights, only he's walking on the side of the highway, and I swear to God it looked like the same guy. Two separate guys in the dark walking/running on the side of the highway? What possible reason could explain that? I didn't see any cars on the side of the road that might have broken down. I was so weirded out I just had an uncomfortable feeling the entire ride home. Story 12. One night I grabbed my son's toy night vision goggles to see if they even worked. If they did, maybe we could see what was making all the weird howling noises in the woods for the last 2 nights. So I looked across the yard into the woods, and there were so many eyes. So many eyes. They were everywhere. In one case there was a grouping of 3 eyes. I had myself convinced it was just an opossum with its baby and I couldn't see the other eye, but then they all blinked at the same time. I have never ever used night vision to look in the woods again. Whatever deformity was there can have its space. Story 13. Something else that happened in rural CO. This is my friend's story. Dress rehearsal for our school play would run a little late sometimes. My friend ended up being one of the last people there. She walked to her car and got in. Something in her rear view mirror caught her eye. She looked through her back window to see that a mountain lion was a few yards away. It wasn't the first instance of a mountain lion being on the school grounds. The middle school was just down the hill from there, and I remember when it locked down because there was a mountain lion outside. Good ol' nature. Story 14. I showed up at a friend's house once, as I did almost every day after school, like 13 years old. I rode my bike everywhere. I usually left it by the side of her pool in her backyard, but as I'm pulling up she starts waving at me from her front porch. Her parents had gotten upset with us for leaving our bikes up there before, but neither of their cars is in the driveway, so I cruise up and we head inside. She immediately locks the door and calls 911. She had been up in her room looking for me to arrive, as she usually did apparently, and spotted a man lurking behind their pool, very near where I usually dropped my bike. I was almost kidnapped or like anything, I don't know. The guy booked it when the cops arrived and they didn't find him. Story 15. I saw a cougar in person once and it was terrifying. Probably less than 10 feet away. If you've never seen a cougar before, you're imagining it too small. They're just shy of 8 feet long on average, and their whole body is muscle. Not muscle like a bull, mind you, but like a tightly coiled wire. Biggest, meanest looking animal I'd ever seen in the wild, and it was completely silent as it went past us. We just stood still for a good couple minutes after it got out of sight. What are some interesting creepy topics to look into? Story 1. The amount of people that go missing in Alaska. Wild. I worked on Adak Island for a bit. They had a fish processing plant that was a midway point for many of the commercial vessels. They asked no questions. If you showed up to work your 12-hour shift, 6 days a week for 6 months, to got paid decent money. Also, they shared a 2-bedroom townhouse with like 12 other people. Didn't matter your nationality or U.S. status, let alone what you did in the past, of if you were merged out during the shift. Story 2. Scuba diving accidents. The one I'm thinking right now, there was more blood and organs outside the victims than in. The story of the guy who purposely tampered with his fiancee's equipment and took her on a dive she wasn't experienced enough for and then let her die down there is probably the worst one. Pretty sure they were married and on their honeymoon. Another diver took a photo of this guy and his dead wife was in the background. He didn't get anywhere near the prison time he should have. Story 3. History of torture techniques and devices. History of medicine. History in general has some pretty creepy crap. This guy was a monster in a white coat. Did lobotomies with an ice pick in the name of medicine. Schizophrenic? Lobotomy. Epileptic? Lobotomy. Depressed? Lobotomy. PTSD? Lobotomy. Female and unhappy with your place in society? Lobotomy. Black, Hispanic / First Nation people? Lobotomy. The classic one-size-fits-all medical solution to all society's ills. And best of all, if the patient didn't want a lobotomy, he could overrule them because he was a doctor. Story 4. Lost cultures and ancient civilizations. It's crazy how much human history is really lost to time and how many different experiences and forms human life must have taken on. It hasn't been very long since our ancestors were trying to eke out a living by hunting and gathering while trying not to be eaten by other animals or dying from diseases or infections. This current life of going to school and having a job is really just a recent format for life. We have the luxury of knowing what exists up above and down below, where just 500 years ago it was anyone's guess. Sure, a few people had a rough idea in some more populated areas, but knowledge didn't spread very fast and could quickly be changed or hidden. Story 5. We live on a time machine of sorts, viewing the stars and galaxies as they looked hundreds, thousands, and billions of years ago. An example is the red giant star Betelgeuse in the upper right of the Orion constellation. It has an orangish hue. As a red giant, it is nearing its end of life. Astronomers have noted that it periodically dims over the past decade and could go supernova at any time. In the astronomic timescale, any time means it could be tomorrow or still thousands of years. Betelgeuse is 642 light years from Earth. If we were to witness its supernova tonight, it means that it actually exploded in the year 1381. Story 6. The amount of people who seem to disappear in the forest even when around others. The silence that is experienced by so many is scary. But it's scary because we know what causes it, a predator that no animal feels like they can outrun or outfight, so their only defense is hiding and staying quiet. Birds still chirp with bears and wolves nearby. Your body still feels the wind with those creatures around. So what is so dangerous, so all-consumingly terrifying that you and every animal in the vicinity go literally dead quiet and alert and all know to fear it? Story 7. Cornflakes. The inventor of cornflakes made it bland and boring so people won't get excited and have intimacy. He also ran a sanitarium, put carbolic acid on little girls' privates so they would never derive pleasure from intimacy, and put wires on boys' Mr. P so that when they had an erection it would cause them pain. Among other things. He believed in some crazy crap. Story 8. If you're into declassified, formerly top secret documents and such, check out the CIA's Project Stargate. There's a guy on YouTube called Mr. Mythos who has 2 excellent videos about it, and he cites all of his sources, most of which are directly from the program itself. Essentially, the CIA used psychic spies throughout the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s. These spies were able to perform a process called remote viewing, in which they were able to see locations that they had zero prior knowledge of. Secret Soviet laboratories, Chinese chemical weapons manufacturing plants, a bunch of crazy scrap hit like that. While remote viewing, they were able to discern a lot of information about these places with relative accuracy, such as personnel, furniture, missile launch codes, things of that nature. Story 9. One small rabbit hole to go down is the entire town of Skidmore, Missouri. So many interesting and strange crimes and people. A child vanished entirely and a woman cut the baby out of another woman. Not to mention the other murders. The most known one was OFC, the town bully murder. So many witnesses yet they all deny it. The most insane thing is that I'm related to one of the witnesses. He was my great uncle. A great man. He had, I think, 6 heart attacks and 4 strokes before finally leaving. The town sheriff at the time of that elimination, he saw it as well, was a pallbearer at my uncle's funeral. The town's population was 300. So many murders and only 300 residents. Story 10. Something that creeps me out is the idea of the uncanny valley effect. Obviously, the likelihood is that, at some primal part of our evolution, we needed to be able to tell the difference between our fellow Homo sapiens and the other types of primal human at the time, like the Neanderthals. What creeps me out is the fact that it still exists and wasn't phased out in our evolution after the other human species died out. You'd think that we would have evolved past it in the absence of any human species other than Homo sapiens purely out of lack of necessity. The fact that evolution and our brains still subconsciously feel that we need to be able to tell the difference between a human and something that isn't quite is kinda terrifying. Makes me wonder whether it could be possible that there's something out there that pretends to be human. Story 11. Black holes. The idea of a horrifying pure black orb that completely traps even light and is so dense it is practically impossible to know what is actually inside is pretty much the definition of terror. The weirdest thing for me is that the moment you pass the event horizon, all world lines point toward the singularity. Nothing in existence we know of can change that. Your future only contains one possibility, and that is the singularity. Black holes can be so massive that your entire planet could pass into its event horizon and you wouldn't even know it. But in that instant, you're trapped in every sense of the word. You could get in a spaceship, blast off from your planet at the speed of light, and it doesn't matter, you're still heading toward the singularity. No matter what direction, or how much speed, or how many likes and subscribes you have makes any difference. You're sitting there on your rocket blasting away from your planet that's falling toward the singularity, and yet you're still heading toward the singularity. In any direction. The universe is gone to you. You are beyond it. Beyond time. Story 12. Skinwalkers. Reminds me of that post by the guy who said he was driving at night through an area famous for its skinwalker activity and a coyote started chasing after his truck. No matter how fast we went, he couldn't shake it off. He was doing 90 at one point and it was still right behind him. I mean, WTF? Even now, just recalling this makes my skin crawl. Story 13. The dark forest theory for why we haven't encountered alien life. Basically, intelligent life is out there, but it's all keeping really quiet because it is terrified of attracting the attention of something particularly horrific. Meanwhile, humanity is pumping out radio waves like crap on the subway watching YouTube videos with no headphones. Story 14. The early history of Christianity, it's not creepy on its face due to mysticism, etc., but rather how something viewed by contemporaries as a common cult could over time prove so insidious as to become the philosophical foundation and worldview for something like over half the living population today. Writers like Celsus, 2nd century CE, treat Christians like most of society views Scientology or QAnon today. Now imagine, in a relatively short amount of time, Q and associated dogma replacing a millennia of societal norms and becoming the primary locus through and by which society is organized. That's essentially what happened between the 2nd and 4th century CE. It's wild how things pan out over the long arc of the observable past and what we can learn from it. Story 15. Space overall. We look at the stars, and yet we have no clue what may be out there, watching us too. You could read about that time we sent a satellite thing into space, and it got some sort of response from who knows where. We got a response from something in space that could be another life form, or maybe just some random rare occurrence that doesn't mean anything. Sometimes I think about our galaxy, and the idea that something alive may be doing something there frees me out. Just the fear of the unknown and the knowledge that we are probably not alone yet we don't see anything is creepy to me. What is the most creepy, unexplained event that has happened in your life? Story 1. Me, my boss, and a coworker were standing at a surface table measuring something when the quarter-ton table moved about 6 inches at one corner across the concrete floor with a loud screech like someone had grabbed it and moved it out of the way. We just looked at each other like, did that just happen? Story 2. My mother died of cancer when I was a little over 30. She got a stroke on a day I was very busy with at school, so my last words to her that she could understand were, "Mom, not now, I'll call you later." 2 hours later, she was admitted to a hospital and never woke up again. Half a year later, I had a minor surgery, but because not the pain, I was given morphine. I was in the hospital bed when my mom came in, took a seat next to my bed, and we talked for an hour. It was so extremely real, I felt her touch on my hand, and we had a very good conversation. I got to know about morphine only a month later when I received the bill. Till then, I was sure it wasn't a hallucination, and I started rethinking my opinion about the possibility of an afterlife. I miss her so much I'd take a shot would I know she'd come to visit me again. Story 3. When I was 19, my girlfriend and I were hanging out in my bedroom when she suddenly let out a shriek and ran for the door. When I caught her in the hallway and calmed her down enough to find out what was wrong, she told me that she saw a live lizard crawl out of my mouth and run down my body, jump to the floor, and ran in her direction. She was dead serious about it and still shaking. Cut to 20 years later, and I'm in the house of a different girlfriend in a different town hanging out in her bedroom. The identical scenario happens. A lizard running out of my mouth, her running out scared, etc. I can't for the life of me fathom how and why this happened. Once was weird enough, but twice? I'm a nice guy, not the Antichrist. Please share any insights you may have about this. Story 4. I lost an opal ring that my father had given me. A few years later, I'd moved to a new house in a different town. My son, who hadn't even been born yet when the ring was lost, was digging with a spoon underneath the concrete slab that served as patio. He pulled out the ring that I'd lost years before. I've never been able to figure out how the ring not only got to the new location, but also got underneath the concrete slab that had been poured long before I lost the ring. I still have the ring, and sometime during its travels the opal was cracked. Story 5. When I was about 15, I was home alone in my house at night. It was just me and my 3 dogs. My dogs were normally very lazy at night. All they would do is lay in their dog beds, chilling out until bedtime. But for some reason on this night, they all became very agitated at the same time. They all kept running into different rooms in my house and growled and barked at empty corners, something that they had never done before or since. I checked the whole house and never found anything. I don't believe in anything supernatural, but that night I slept in my parents' bedroom with the door locked, a gun next to me, and all 3 dogs on the bed with me. Story 6. My family was sitting on the back porch watching a thunderstorm. My older brother grabbed a toy gun out of my hand and said, "Watch this." He pointed the gun at a tree in the backyard and pulled the trigger. As the toy gun popped, lightning struck the tree he was aiming at and the tree fell over. He handed me the toy gun back with a smile and walked away. My parents witnessed this event as well. It was a coincidence, but was his smile creepy? Like he knew it was going to happen. Story 7. When I was in the Marines, we were doing a long night march. This was School of Infantry, East Coast, actually. We had one of our all too brief rest stops and started back up again. I kinda tried to daydream, and in what seemed like only a couple minutes we were doing another rest stop, which I was pleasantly surprised about. I asked the guy marching alongside me why we're stopping again so soon, and he said, "Dude, what are you talking about? The last one was hours ago." Story 8. First, let me say I don't believe in ghosts or demons or anything like that. My wife and I had just gotten married. We lived in a small, 1-bedroom apartment, and I got up one night to take a leak and just had a creepy feeling while I'm standing in the bathroom. Like the hairs on my neck were standing up. Anyway, I shake it off and go back to bed. The next morning my wife tells me she had a terrible dream about a demon that was watching her. I didn't tell her about my feeling because it would have scared the crap out of her. Still weirds me out a little. Story 9. Smoking a cigarette outside, as sober as a worm, I see 2 very bright glowing red balls. It looked like they were squirrels playing tag, but they were indeed bright, glowing red balls that almost looked transparent. After a good 2 minutes of watching this, the balls then shot up about 20 feet in the sky, hovered menacingly, and just fell. I ran over to the house across the ST to look in their yard and see where they went. They vanished, and that was something I'll probably never see again. Has anyone experienced this as well? Story 10. Coworker of mine in a restaurant. He was doing prep in the morning in a completely empty building. Goes to make a poo, and while in there he can clearly hear the sounds of the door just outside of the restroom that leads to our patio open and close. As no one is supposed to be in the restaurant, we are only open for dinner service. He bolts up and no one is there. So he checks the security cams. He sees himself walk into the bathroom, then the screens go all white fuzz for a few minutes, then the click back when he runs out. I saw the footage that crap happened. Very eerie. Story 11. My friend had a doctor's appointment and took his dad with him. It was in another town about an hour away, and since the appointment was for 11 a.m., they left at 9:30 to give themselves plenty of time. They pulled into the parking lot at 10:30. My friend said he remembered checking the clock in the car when they arrived and remarking to his dad that they made good time. They went into the office, and the receptionist pointed out that they were a little late, but that it was okay because the doctor was running behind. My friend told her that he had an 11 o'clock appointment and that he was actually a half hour early, and she pointed to the clock on the waiting room wall, which said 11:15. His dad checked his watch. 11:15, my friend ran out and checked the clock in the car. 11:15, somehow, in the few dozen steps from the car to the office, they'd lost 45 minutes. When they got home, my friend's mom verified that they'd left home at 9:30 and there hadn't been heavy traffic or delays of any kind. It's a mystery to this day. Story 12. When I was 12, I woke up in the middle of the night to loud breathing under my bed. Being 12 and into reading fantasy and science fiction books, I was convinced there was a demon or cryptid or something that was going to eat me. I finally decided to risk it and run up to my mom's room to sleep in her bed. I made it safely without being dragged under the bed, and I told her what happened. She was convinced I just had a nightmare. The next night I heard it again, and since it was only like 9 at night, I called to my mom so she could hear it. She was like 10 feet away and could hear it clear as day. There was nothing under my bed. Over the next couple of months, I kept hearing it, although not nightly. It slowly started to sound more like purring than breathing. My brother came home from college and checked under my bed and made me lift my hands to double check that I wasn't playing a prank. We never found out what was breathing under my bed, although we suspect it might have been acoustics. Story 13. Happened to me over 30 years ago. Overslept, but called in my nonsense story that I was running late due to car stalling out in front of the church, thinking the little details sell the lie. Small town, everyone knows the spot. The next day on my way to work, and on time, my car stalled in that exact same spot. Would not restart. Freaks me out so much I avoid driving by that church to this day. Story 14. We participate in Passover, and every year, without fail, our cats begin acting up and interacting with things that we can't see. It's usually a process involving staring at them, running from them, and/or hissing at them. Last year, I was curious, so I decided to try to communicate with whatever it was / they were after our cats acted up. I said something that went along the lines of asking if anyone was there. My electric duster, which wasn't plugged in, turned on for slightly under a second. In addition to being plugged in, a button needs to be pressed for it to turn on. Nothing happened after that, and I can't find any logical explanation for this. That device, which I still use and have had for years, has never turned on without being plugged in. It doesn't use batteries either. Story 15. It's 3 a.m. and I'm in my front yard just smoking a joint chillin' when out of the blue down the road I see a dude walking towards me. In my neighborhood there's a bunch of houses behind me, but ahead is just construction. So now I'm thinking, was this guy sleeping in these empty wooden houses? He passes by me, and as he passes he mumbles something, but I can't really hear it good. He also sounds concerned, and as he walks on by I hear someone call my name behind me. I turn back and no one's there, but when I look to see where the guy went, he's turned around and walking back toward me. Freaked the mess out, I run inside and lock the door. I look out the window and I see the guy walking back and forth and eventually leave. Then I heard a knock at the door. I looked and no one was there. Creepiest night in a long time. Men, what are creepy things women do that usually goes unnoticed? Story 1. Calling someone to harass them for breaking up with their friend. I once broke up with a girl and her friends called to harass me, but I was such a nice guy that I just can't yell at you. When I saw who was calling, I'd answer with, "Hey, you calling 'cause I broke up with Melinda?" I understand, feel free to yell at me. No one yelled at me. Story 2. This happened to a good buddy of mine. He was asked out by the girl in one of our classes who he barely knew and had basically never talked to. He politely declined and moved on, didn't think much about it. She continued to post on social media for months in a very explicit manner how he missed out on her and how she's too good for him and how he was ghosting her. I brought it up with him and he said he didn't really care, so he let it go. But I was super pissed with her. Romantically accosting people on the internet is never cool. Story 3. A woman tried this on a mate of mine. She pretended she had been cheating on him. He straight up was like, "Cool, get out please, don't contact me again." She seemed to think he would get jealous and try to fight for her. When she told him it was just to see how much he loved her, he still broke up with her. "Cool, get the mess out and don't contact me again, I'm not dealing with that crap." Even more creepy, he got crap on all over Facebook by all her friends, too. They were messaging his mates, his family members, etc., saying what a terrible person he was, he couldn't commit to a real relationship, etc. Him breaking up with someone showing a notorious red flag introduced us all to a tone of other women that all displayed a mess load of red flags. It was creepy as sin. Story 4. I was in my early/mid-20s grooving near the bar at a concert waiting for a drink. Some mildly attractive girl comes up to me and asks me to help her roll her sleeves up on her jean jacket. At the time I was quite more oblivious to signals, so I thought this is an odd request, but I obliged and went back to my headspace waiting for a drink. She immediately went aggressive/toxic and said, "What are you, gay or something?" with this pissed off look on her face. I shot her back an extremely confused look considering I just helped her with something, threw a red flag on the play, received my drink, and returned to my crew. She was so upset, continuing to call after me as I boogied off and enjoyed the rest of the show. That was an eye-opener. Story 5. Had to work with an ex of mine due to us both having leadership positions in our chorus program in high school. I was as polite to her even though I knew there was something under the surface with her. Apparently, she had been obsessed over me during lockdown to a scary level after I'd broken up with her right before COVID hit. Found out later she had seriously considered lighting my front yard on fire during the dry season through text as we lived in the same neighborhood. Definitely made me very anxious to be around her afterwards. Moved miles away and thankfully don't have to worry about her anymore. Story 6. I was dating this girl who ended up faking that she would do a surprise visit to my house while I lived very far away. She'd text me that she'd be there in 2 minutes and was annoyed that I was annoyed that she'd show up unannounced while she wouldn't even know if I was home or not. After I broke it off, she did it a couple times more. She convinced a friend of mine to lure me into a bar where she was so she could win me back. I came into the bar, my friend wasn't there, but the girl I ended things with and eventually blocked when things went too far was there, and she went as far as blocking my path to the exit, saying that if I left she would scream that I was threatening her. I'm not saying it's all women, but I've had a few experiences like this, although they didn't go that far. Story 7. Women, the number of you with long nails that are crusty underneath is alarmingly high. I even had a former coworker who regularly kept her nails at 3-inch length who once commented on me cleaning under my nails and remarked inquisitively as to why she always sees men cleaning under them, and that it made no sense to her. I then glanced at hers, and I can only describe what I saw as an accumulation of sebum, dead skin, and potato chip crumbs. Please clean under your nails. Story 8. The manipulation of social media for their own interests. I'm not talking editing photos, I'm talking about manipulating guys' feelings by posting certain things to make them mad/jealous/etc. I'm talking about stalking guys on Snapchat maps and finding names of people there with by scouring Instagram followers lists. The big one that really just weirds me out is how a lot of girls on some level view their Instagram and Snapchat profiles as tools instead of a place to keep up to date with friends. I am also completely aware that not all girls are like this, it may even be a minority of girls who are like this, but this is a view I got from my own experiences and people I grew up around. And 2, guys do this crap too, and it creeps me out just as much, if not more, due to the power dynamics and potential harm that an abusive guy can do to a girl. Story 9. A creepy thing that everyone does, but I find women, particularly those who can't have children, more often do. Keeping animals that should be put down alive. And I don't mean, oh, the animal is getting a bit old or aggressive. No, I mean the animal is blind, deaf, crippled with no recovery, constant infections, and other problems. They keep this animal alive because it is their baby. I find the act incredibly creepy and, in my personal opinion, extremely abusive toward the animal, as you are perpetuating its life through a hellish experience, because you are not mature enough to let the animal go. Story 10. I'm a woman over 40. Truth. A lot of damaged women who put all the blame on all men. Apparently everyone's ex was an abusive narcissist, and therefore you are too. Lying about their age and thinking those fillers make them appear young instead of desperate. The worst thing is lying about their exes in court, or even just spreading really malicious rumors. They do this lying so they can play the victim in hopes that some man will rescue them. I know a lot of good women. I've come across a lot of evil women. Story 11. 2 years ago, I was on an archaeological dig where one of the other students was a woman about 10 years older than me. On the first day in the field, before I even knew her name or said a word to her, she walked up to me and said, "You have really big hamstrings." At the end of each day in the field, she used to walk around with her shirt off while we were packing up. The worst thing she did though was one day while I was screening, using a screen to check sand we had removed from the ground for any small artifacts we might have missed, she came right up behind me, got really close, and said, "Do you have tan lines from those shorts? I bet you could pull off something a lot shorter." Can you imagine if the roles there had been reversed? I'd be on probation if I said something like that to a woman. Story 12. Making veiled threats in the form of innocuous statements, oftentimes planting the seed of "I can accuse you of anything I want and no one will question it." I pick up on that from a chick and I make sure to avoid her at all costs. False accusations have become prolific in our society, and it's long since turned into a legit danger for men. Ladies, if you're not actually serious, just understand it's not funny. You can literally get us killed because you wanted to power trip for a second. Story 13. Was at a PTA event at school like the opening week, so they did a PowerPoint animated slideshow to introduce all the teachers. When the younger early 20s male gym teacher was up on the screen, there was like a little uproar from all the moms. Like about him being hot, etc. Even weirder is he grew up on the next block and went to the same school when he was a kid, and his mom is still my neighbor. If the guys did the same for a hot female teacher, I'm sure they would have been run out of the room. Story 14. Women getting away with being bad mothers just because they're women. Oh yeah, then pinning it on their husbands and the father of their children with little effort because society honesty does the rest of the work for them. Women get far too much benefit for being seen as weak and fragile and can't do any harm, even though society was built to oppress women. The things women are able to get away with are honestly at the fault of the patriarchy, and they negatively affect everyone. So everyone should be against the patriarchy. Story 15. Comparing their husbands/boyfriends to each other's, or straight up belittling them behind their backs. Since working with predominantly women, I've noticed they casually slam their men when talking to other women, whether it be not being muscular enough, him being a pussy about something, gaining weight, being cheap, etc. There's just a line guys don't cross when it comes to our partners, outside of venting about regular relationship stuff. When we talk about our partners, we just don't belittle them or compare them to other guys' girlfriends/wives. It's just the opposite with women though. They're just always critiquing and nitpicking their men.